Our dearest audience, welcome to this episode of the Markets Talk Show, brought to you by Bahrain Bourse, a show designed specially for you, bringing in top market experts to discuss capital markets and help you make better informed investment decisions. In today's episode, we'll be deep diving into sustainable investments and green finance to better understand what opportunities these markets offer us as retail savers and investors. In this episode, we're pleased to be joined by Mr. Joseph Ghorayeb, the CEO of HSBC in Bahrain. Joseph previously has been the country head of wholesale banking in HSBC Bank Middle East Limited. Joseph joined HSBC Group in 2006 as a coverage banker in Canada before relocating to the GCC and holding senior roles in the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain. Joseph is a qualified mechanical engineer, graduated from McGill University in Canada, from which he holds his MBA in finance as well as being a CFA charter holder. Joseph, it's lovely to have you with us on the show today. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. We'd like to deep dive straight into sustainable investments and green finance, with reports showing that this sector, and especially the green investments in key industries in the GCC, are likely to attract high levels of investment when creating over 1 million jobs, attracting FDI, and also unlocking over $2 trillion in cumulative GDP between now and 2030. So we wanted to understand from you, what does sustainable investments and green finance actually mean?
In order to build a solar plant, a windmill farm, or a green hydrogen plant, you will require capital. This capital will come from retail, institutional investors. It'll come from financial institutions and sometimes governments. There are two types at a high level of projects in sustainability. There are the green projects and there are the sustainability-linked projects. On green projects, usually the financing, the use of proceeds goes towards projects like solar plants, windmill farms. Whereas sustainability-linked, it's about transition financing. It's about supporting companies, supporting countries, finance their transition towards net zero. In the GCC, a number of governments have announced their net zero plans. And we're looking more and more convergence between many stakeholders, including governments, regulators, investors, financial institutions, to find the capital to invest into this net zero transition.
Fantastic. So we see that it's a huge industry with a lot of finance being relocated there. So if someone of our retail investors are listening, why should they care about these developments? And why would integrating sustainability-linked investments be key to their portfolios?
So there are four long-term trends which will require focus, and automation and digital, demographics and future consumer, future transport and mobility, and trade flows and supply chain. These four key long-term trends will reshape economies, markets, and societies worldwide. GCC will definitely play a role in supporting these trends, either by partnering with industry players, industry experts, or creating these industries within the GCC, or creating manufacturing hubs that exports into the world. I said I'm going to talk about two themes in particular, automation and digital. You see a lot of manufacturing and finance companies adopting new automation technologies to boost productivity. And automation is expected to reduce waste and carbon emissions. So you can see already that if you follow this trend, the capital will have to go there. And as an investor, you would like to put your capital in this trend. The other trend is trade flows. It's being disrupted. We saw in COVID how the supply chain got disrupted. You need to understand in the GCC, the exporters and importers, what are they doing? Which geographies they're going after, how they're changing their supply chain. And by doing that, you'll be able to identify the winners and the losers going forward.
So if I picked up on what you shared correctly, we're seeing a huge kind of trend in those markets, and so we're going to see capital deployment shift there as well. So for a retail saver or investor, looking into those markets could ideally project what their investments could look like going forward. They could be areas of interest to them.
Exactly. So there are companies that will have to change the way they operate, potentially may have to partner with other companies. Some companies may no longer exist in the future. and some companies may be born out of the necessity of these long-term trends. So you have to watch carefully and understand company by company what their strategy is for the future.
Fantastic. So we're seeing changing market dynamics from what you are sharing. And I did hear you refer to a couple of terms, so that allows me to then ask you. You mentioned transition financing. What does transition financing mean? And additionally, if there are any themes or sectors where we see this more dominant?
If you look at power, fuel, we need it for electricity, we need it for industries, we need it to warm ourselves up, we need it to cool ourselves up. So all this requires an energy source. And transition is about measuring the current energy sources and how much carbon they emit, and trying to find new ways of lowering those carbon emissions. I mentioned solar, I mentioned wind, green hydrogen, and also there's a lot of technologies being developed to help lower these carbon emissions, find new sources of fuel for the future.
So it's the sort of financing products, let's say, that allow companies or industries to shift into being more green or more sustainable.
Absolutely. And this is what energy transition is. It's through technology, through using different sources, changing the way they operate, finding efficiencies in their supply chain. So there are a number of initiatives that a company can launch in order to lower its carbon footprint.
Fantastic. So I can't talk about investments with you without referring to performance. So when we look at traditional investments, which we've discussed in our previous episodes, we discussed the expected performance for those products and those sectors. If we compare ESG-related investments to traditional investments, how has the performance been and what's the expected trajectory like?
Some investors may tell you that historically ESG performance has lagged the traditional performance. But in fact, if you look at lately, ESG has performed as well, if not better, than traditional benchmarks. Just give you an example, if you look at the Vanguard ESG ETF versus the Vanguard traditional ETF, the performance has been quite similar, and sometimes the ESG was able to outperform the traditional stocks in that index.
So we're seeing comparable performance from what you're mentioning, but we're also seeing investments with a purpose, leading me to say, if someone was listening today and they wanted to be inspired by you and wanted to become more responsible investors, are there any products or tools or resources that you could share that could guide them onto that journey?
The key here is investor education and awareness. It is a nascent topic. We're all learning about it. We're all growing into it. So I would highly recommend, as a retail investor, to learn and seek sources that will raise your awareness so you can know where you place your capital. Why is it important to have that ESG lens when you're looking at your investment? I think ESG investments will align with future trends like decarbonization, like energy security, and social well-being. So that's one trend that ESG will align with. The other alignment that we see is regulatory. There's a regulatory momentum. Governments and regulators worldwide are implementing regulations to address climate change. So you can see where this is going as an investor. So you need to follow and be on the same path. And finally, risk management. ESG is seen as a tool to navigate reputational risk. And if you're able to manage your risk, usually your returns will outperform riskier businesses.
Okay, so within your answer, we referred to ESG, which from our discussions is environmental, social, and governance. And so those sort of investments tackle not just the environment, but like you mentioned, social well-being and also governance with respect to risk management aspects.
Absolutely. Environment is about climate, but we're seeing also a lot of focus on social well-being, poverty. We're seeing bonds being issued, social bonds being issued in the market, diversity. So there are instruments that not only look at climate, they also look at the social aspect of ESG.
I think that's very interesting because you mentioned social bonds, and we've been reading a lot about them in the news. And I think it's interesting if you could just share a little bit on what is a social bond, because we know that bonds are products that perhaps governments or institutions can use to borrow money. But what do I mean when I say a social bond?
A good example is if you want to promote women's entrepreneurs in a certain country. You would be able potentially to structure a social bond where investors can come in and participate and help women entrepreneurs create companies, run companies, and grow and be part of the economic growth of that country. That's one example.
So we're basically seeing our, let's say, standard financial products, but they are targeted with a purpose. And so thus they are called social bonds or climate stocks or what be it.
Absolutely, yes.
Great. So that's a great segue to take you into climate stocks. And again, we've really want to deep dive to understand what is a climate stock, how does it differ from a regular shareholding in a regular company, and additionally, if anything about their performance stands out.
Climate stocks are by definition for companies that generate 50% and more of their revenue from climate-related technologies or contributions into the economy. In 2024, actually, they performed quite well. And in certain sectors of these climate stocks, they outperformed the market. Sectors like efficiency. I mentioned about a company looking at making its processes and procedures more efficient. So there are companies that you can hire to help you do that. In waste, companies that help companies manage better their waste. In water, in rubbish, these climate stocks have outperformed the market. And finally, in nuclear, not something that we're very familiar maybe in the GCC, but nuclear as well, climate stocks have done well in recent time.
Okay, so just to make sure I understand correctly, it's a stock that, like a regular stock, I'm investing into a company. However, this company directs more than 50% of its efforts towards one of the agendas that you shared, whether it was nuclear or power or any of those discussions.
Correct, yes.
Great. Now, we can't go ahead with this topic without discussing climate issues. Are there any dominant climate issues that we should be aware of in 2025?
Yeah, maybe I'll talk about MENAT specifically, since we are in the GCC. I would like to direct the investors to keep an eye on few things that are happening in 2025. Countries are expected to submit their revised targets for 2035 and also tell the market how they've been doing, so actual emissions versus their commitments. So that's something to watch for because it will give you the path towards their net zero commitment, whether it's in 2050 or 2060. So that's one thing to keep an eye on. The second thing is carbon markets. Everybody's talking about it. We're seeing some countries starting to create either voluntary carbon markets or what we call regulated carbon markets. So simply put, what are carbon markets, voluntary or regulated? It's about setting a price for CO2 emissions. And then you can either start trading those notes, or you can start purchasing to offset certain areas of your operations that cannot be transitioned. So we expect these type of markets to start growing, and hopefully when they become mature and in steady state, they'll help everybody, companies, governments, individuals, offset their carbon footprint.
So when you talk about carbon footprint, because you also discussed net zero, if you can shed light on net zero as a concept, because I understand also our leadership in Bahrain has committed to it. So what then does net zero actually mean? And additionally, if you can tie that into where do we find carbon markets in the GCC if they are available?
Yeah, I mean, carbon markets, we are seeing Saudi have launched a voluntary carbon market. We have seen examples in Egypt. In Bahrain, Mumtalakat has recently launched SAFA, which is a voluntary carbon market tool. And it's for individuals and corporations to go and potentially purchase purchase an offset or participate in offering an offset for again an individual or a corporation. And net zero as a concept, if you think about an individual carbon footprint, you cannot offset 100% of your carbon, but you can offset some of it. So ultimately you can be still emitting some carbon, but use the tools to offset that carbon instead of eliminating it.
Okay, so that means if I'm having a carbon footprint, I'm having some sort of CO2 emissions, and that's my negative impact on the environment. I can engage in certain activities that has a positive impact on the environment, and so net, as we would say, I would have a net zero contribution.
Exactly. I mean, an example from Bahrain is the commitment that they've done during COP26 is plant mangroves and trees. So this is one way of offsetting potentially some industries that are emitting carbon by planting trees.
Fantastic. Now, we want to go on and say there possibly are a lot of opportunities and a lot of challenges, especially when we discuss the transition activities in the Middle East. So if you can help us shed some light on that.
So I mentioned previously that the GCC governments have committed to either a 2050 or 2060 net zero. And they had set some electrification targets. As an example, for Bahrain, by 2035, 20% of the electricity grid will come from alternative sources of energy. In Bahrain, several ambitious targets and objectives have been set to address the climate challenges. Reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% is an example. I mentioned the 20% electrification by 2035, increasing the mangroves 4 times in the kingdom, doubling the number of trees. And I'm hoping you can see that some trees are being planted in Bahrain all over the place. Entities of the government have been doing a lot as well. I can mention a few. Babco Energies, if you go on their website, they have their sustainability strategy published for everybody to look at, and they've been leading the Net Zero 2060 push for the kingdom. There's the Ministry of Oil and Environment, Supreme Council of Environment, the Ministry of SDG, and all these government-related entities are driving and collaborating for that Net Zero 2060. And last but not least, the Bahrain Bourse, who last year has issued with the Central Bank of Bahrain regulations around mandating publicly listed companies to publish their ESG strategies. All these sources, as an investor, you need to consult, you need to read, and this is how, again, I come back to the key of education and raising awareness. And this is where you'll identify the companies that are going on the right path and the companies that may need support to transition towards that path.
It's really notable from your answer, though, that within the GCC and more specifically in Bahrain, we're seeing efforts coming obviously from the leadership, but then trickling its way down to the public sector, the private sector, and the retail. And I think there is a lot to learn, like you suggested. Joseph, if there was a fresh retail investor just starting up their investment portfolio, and then they want to add some of the sustainable investments or the green finance products that you referred to, help walk them through a step-by-step guide on what you would do if you were in their shoes.
Yeah, so there's a lot of sources that you can look into to see where you want to put your capital or investment. A lot of the indices around the world have created a separate ESG index, which contains either company stocks or bonds, fixed income instruments. And this is one way of studying the index and looking at putting money there. But at the same time as well, there are sources where you need to learn about the different sectors of around the world and how they're transitioning their operations, because that will also give you an idea of where you want to potentially put your money in the stock market. One source that I would recommend is if you go to the HSBC Group's climate page, there's a very interesting guide that you can consult. It's about 120-page that talks about each sector globally and how that sector is transitioning, what type of investments are required in these sectors, and what are the opportunities and challenges in these sectors. So I would highly recommend an investor to go and consult these type of guides. And finally, if you're dealing with a broker, ask the question to your broker, which funds have an ESG component in them, which funds don't, and look at these funds, study them, and try to decide if you want to put your money in there or not.
Fantastic. So I know you're a very avid educator. So if I wanted to start, your first thing for me would be that I go and read from the resources that are available. HSBC has more of a global outlook to understand the sectors. Would there be anything on the GCC that I could look into just to study something more regional or more local?
Yes, the Bahrain Bourse, if you go to their website, they have a sustainability financing guide. That's one example. And as I said, the Supreme Council of Environment, if you go on that website, they have a lot of resources around what they're doing around climate, around adaptation risk. And when I mention adaptation, it's about water conservation, agriculture, food, physical risk of the island. So in Bahrain, the government entities on their websites, there's a wealth of resources that an investor can consult and learn about this topic.
Fantastic. So I listened to the show, I read the resources, I realized that it is for me to invest in those kind of investments, and I'm based in Bahrain. So would there be any particular issuances in the region that can be green or they can be sustainable that I can participate in, or even the indices that you referred to that I could have access to invest in them?
Yes. I mentioned climate stocks. That's one type of instrument. There's green bonds that have been issued by some GCC countries. That's one other instrument. There's sustainability-linked bonds as well that have been issued by some countries and some companies. And finally, there's stocks of publicly listed companies that have issued their ESG strategy. And as an investor, if you're comfortable with that strategy, you may want to look at it as
Great.
well.
So what I can tell is there is a lot to learn, but more importantly, there is a lot of resources where I can allocate my money within the GCC, within Bahrain. So this is very exciting. Thank you. Joseph, whenever we're joined on the show with expert speakers like yourself, we like to wrap up by learning more from them. So if there is a retail saver investor sitting at home and they want to start their investments into the sustainable investments and green finance, what would be your advice to them, and probably just more of a step-by-step on what they should do to start with this journey?
Yes. As I mentioned, a lot is happening in Bahrain and the GCC and the world around the ESG topic. I already mentioned that some sectors and companies are already transitioning their operations model, and some others are in the planning phase. Eventually, we expect all sectors and companies to get to a point where they converge towards that net zero target. However, that will require a collaboration from all stakeholders and an alignment. And when I talk about stakeholders, you've got the regulators, you've got the government-related entities, which is the public sector, you've got the private sector, and then you've got the investors, individuals and institutional. And if you find a way for all these stakeholders to collaborate, naturally, I think capital will flow towards supporting companies' transition, supporting countries' transition towards that net zero. And I would expect retail investors then to follow also that path. I would end by saying, look, we are on this journey together. Please continue educating yourself, continue raising your awareness. And a key to our collective success is to collaborate as all stakeholders. And I would end by saying, stay curious and keep on learning.
It's wonderful to have a speaker who comes in and encourages us to stay educated, encourages us to stay learning. So thank you so much for making the time to join today and to also share your insights. We really appreciate having you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Our dearest audience, thank you for tuning in to this episode. We hope that you found it informative and insightful. As always, stay informed, stay invested. We'll see you next time.